Hello, Garland Nixon here with Caleb Maupin. He's with the Center for Political Innovation. And we were going to talk about his book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, where the Neoconservatives came from, but he actually wrote a book about the potential for violence, such as things that have happened. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So he's also written a book about the potential for violence in our society that I think we need to discuss in light of what happened with Charlie Kirk. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Caleb Maupin. I hope you're watching it on either my channel or Caleb Maupin's channel. Caleb does a lot of great work with CPI and has the great shows. I often lurk in the background. I get caught every now and then when I can't help but commenting, but I'm often lurking in the background on Caleb's channel. Like I'm in the house, I got the TV on, I'm wandering around and Caleb's on or whatever. I have the TV in the bedroom and I'm walking back and forth listening and stuff like that. And then every now and then I will comment or something. At any rate, Caleb, this is an important day. What happened with Charlie Kirk. We're going to talk about Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, but what's important is you wrote a book, because I've discussed this thing and I've said, I look at it and there are indications that this could be professional. You know what I mean? There are indications this could have been a professional hit. And one of the things that I'm always suspicious of, the intelligence community, the ruling elite, they always want to set us against each other, get us fighting against each other, get us using violence against each other, beating ourselves to death. And then that gives them, they've got to crack down and sending more troops in the street, etc. Not saying that that's it, but we always have to be suspicious of that. You wrote a book after the Luigi thing to just talk about this type of incident. Yeah. Maybe you can
so after the killing of Brian Thompson, allegedly done by Luigi Mangione, he hasn't been convicted, and I'm not sure he did it, honestly. But after that happened, I saw there was a wave of celebration of what was an act of political violence. I mean, it was just an assassination. And all over social media, it was just immediately, we were just supposed to celebrate this act of lawless violence that wasn't really going to change the healthcare system. And I noticed that some of the very same people who had dumped on Jimmy Dore and his Force the Vote and had dumped on the Medicare for All marches, you can't have a peaceful movement. You can't have a parliamentary procedure, but an act of violence was okay. And so I wrote a book warning. It was called The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. And I talked about the years of lead in Italy. In the 60s and 70s, it looked like Italy was going to leave NATO. The Communist Party was rising in popularity. And there were some of the right-wing groups that were also kind of anti-US and didn't want to join NATO, didn't want to be part of NATO any longer. And it looked like through the elections, Italy might leave NATO. And so you had a phenomenon called the Years of Lead, where the Italian social movement, which was a fascist group that admired Mussolini, began assassinating communists. And then the communists, like a breakaway from the Italian Communist Party happened called the Red Brigades. And the Red Brigades started assassinating fascists and also kidnapping bosses when there was a strike. And then pretty soon, they started killing leaders of the Italian Communist Party because they thought the Italian Communist Party was working with the government against them. And violence in Italy got really ugly. And about 400 people died in bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, but thousands more were crippled for life. They were shot in their legs. That was like a thing with the mafia, like kneecapping, they called it. And people just didn't want to get involved in politics. And even though the polls showed the majority of Italians wanted to leave NATO, they stayed in NATO because they couldn't form a political movement to actually do it because it just led to the population being weary. And I used that as an example of how, escalating and creating a culture of political violence is a way of quelling dissent. People often, they think a revolution is, we got to teach people to go out and get violent. Actually, that's not the case. If you look at violent revolutions that have happened in history, what they are is that the masses of people have learned over the course of years of struggle that they can't change things peacefully and that they're in danger. It's almost a kill or be killed situation. The Chinese communists, they joined a coalition government with the KMT, and then the KMT started killing them, so they fled to the countryside. Then they aligned with the KMT again against Japan. They tried to form a coalition government after World War II, and ultimately they came to power. And the Russian Revolution is a similar thing. You know, the Tsar was brought down. They formed this kind of dual power, dual government structure called the Soviets. And then the government tried to crush it, and then they defended it, and they defended St. Petersburg from General Kornilov. And that revolutions, when you do have a violent revolution, it's an act of self-defense by millions of people who feel, look, we have no other choice. But random assassinations, you know, some guy going out and saying, you know, I don't like this guy, I'm going to kill him. That is something that serious activists and revolutionaries have always opposed as a tactic, because what it leads to is it enables the government to crack down on radicals and those that are dissidents. It also makes people afraid to get involved in politics because it's a bloody mess and people are getting shot. And it's not just the years of lead in Italy. In my book, I talked about Jamaica in the 1980s. In Jamaica, they elected Michael Manley, who was a socialist, kind of a friend of Fidel Castro. He was democratically elected. He wanted to move Jamaica towards socialism. And so gang violence between gangs that were aligned with him and gangs that were against him escalated. And the CIA was shipping weapons and guns into Jamaica. And a group called Shower Posse was created that started assassinating leaders of the Jamaican People's Party. And so the Jamaican Labor Party, they were facing assassination from the radicals, and and Bob Marley went down there and did his One Love concert to try and calm the violence. But a culture of political violence was created in Jamaica, and ultimately Michael Manley left office, and Jamaica never became a socialist country. Even like Northern Ireland, the provisional IRA was waging an armed struggle against the British government. And the British government realized that whenever the British army went out to fight the IRA, that just made the IRA more popular. So what they did is they started giving guns and weapons to Protestant groups to kill the IRA. And that way it became Catholics versus Protestants. It became like an ethnic thing rather than the imperialists versus the Irish people. And then they funded IRA breakaway groups to fight the IRA. And they paid drug traffickers to target the IRA. So then the IRA had to enter alliance with other drug traffickers to protect them. And by the 90s, there was just so much killing and violence, and most people couldn't tell who was on what side, and they just wanted to give peace a chance. And the IRA surrendered, and Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. And that this tactic of just escalating, creating senseless, chaotic political violence, that is a way to control dissent, and the status quo just kind of wins by default. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. I believe that is what is happening right now in America. I believe that, the way they celebrated Brian Thompson's killing, the way every time one of these assassinations or assassination attempts happens, the internet is full of people, no matter who it is, cheering and saying, oh yeah, we should do this. This is really, really unhealthy. And it corresponds with the fact that our politics, we don't have real politics. We have fandom and anti-fandom. And this is something I talked about also, right? The way it is now, if you're interested in politics, you find somebody on social media that you really like, and you start following them, and then they have a fight with somebody else, and you really like this one person that you follow, and you hate that other person. And it's this battle of personalities. Charlie Kirk, let's point this out. He's never been elected to government office. He's not a politician. He's a social media personality, right? But he's somebody who was on the internet talking about politics as a conservative, saying things that a lot of people were very, very offended by. And the memo has been sent out among a lot of leftists that if somebody says something that you consider to be racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever, which Charlie Kirk certainly did say things that people considered to be that it's okay to be violent against them. And that memo being sent out is going to hurt all political people in America. It's going to be, people aren't going to go to rallies and demonstrations. People aren't going to, get out there and get involved if they're afraid they're going to get shot. This is not a revolution. This is not progressive. And like you said, the details of the assassination also raised some questions. That person was really skilled in what they did. That's not what an average person could just do. This is a really bad day for anyone who's interested in politics and anyone who's questioning the status quo. And, Charlie Kirk, he was pro-Israel, he was a lot of things, but he was critical of U.S. support for Ukraine. He did take that position. He was critical of U.S. support for Ukraine. And isn't it interesting? There's been a long pattern of people. The first one was Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe is this regular conservative Japanese politician. And when the special military operation happened, he said, you know what? Maybe Russia's in the wrong, but Putin is a good guy, and I don't think we should go escalate against Russia. Couple weeks later, boom, he's dead. Right? And Fico in Slovakia, he's on the left. He's a social democrat, sympathetic to Russia. He gets shot. right? And we saw Trump twice. Trump, faced assassin bullets. One of the assassins was literally a Ukrainiac, a mentally ill guy who'd been in prison, had gotten out of prison and gone and volunteered to fight in Ukraine. And then he came right back from Ukraine and came to the United States and tried to kill Trump outside of Mar-a-Lago. I'm seeing a pattern here.
Might I add, and in case for those who didn't know it, Judge Cannon it says the evidence in Trump's case from attempted assassin Ryan Ruth will be sealed. The court finds that the United States has made a sufficient showing that the information at issue was classified pursuant to Executive Order 13526 and its predecessors, and that its disclosure could cause serious damage or exceptionally grave damages to the national security of the United States. Now, everyone wants to know what the evidence is. He had ties to Ukraine. Is that the problem? So anybody can look this up. The judge in the Ryan Ruth case, who is the Ukrainiac lunatic, who was supposedly on the fifth hole at Mar-a-Lago, a judge has ruled that the evidence against him is sealed because, quote, it could cause serious damage or exceptionally grave damages to the national security of the United States. How suspicious does that sound, Caleb?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, this is, so I'm seeing a bit of a pattern here. But ultimately, I really want to urge people to not celebrate and glorify political violence, no matter who it's against, right? It could be the worst, most despicable, awful person you've ever managed, the Pedophile Rights Association or the Killing Puppies Club or whatever. It doesn't matter. If you're killing people for their political beliefs is not a good thing to do, right? And that lone acts of violence and shooting people down is not a way to make a political statement. This is not a good thing. And if our society deteriorates further into this becoming a regular occurrence, which is happening constantly now, right? There was what happened in Minnesota at that Catholic school. That was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And we have got to get away from the idea that the way you make change is, all on your own. You get yourself a gun and you run out there and do something on your own. That's not the case. Change comes from building political movements, from people joining together and standing arm in arm and demanding things and learning how to work together and carry out operations, right? Imagine, I used the example in my book about Brian Thompson, about danger of American use of lead. I said, imagine that there had been a political civil disobedience at the United Healthcare office, and hundreds of people had gone in there like Dr. Martin Luther King used to do, and they'd sat down, they joined arms, and they made the police drag them out one by one, right? And demanded healthcare for all, demanded that they stop denying coverage. And, they had done this a few times to the point that media had to cover it, and they learned and they worked together through doing it, and they overcame whatever their differences were, and they learned how to carry out an effective civil disobedience and get media attention and all of that. We would be a lot closer to having Medicare for all as a result of that than some guy just going off and shooting somebody, right? And it's very suspicious that the media celebrated what Luigi Mangione did. It's also very disturbing. I will say that, the New York Times ran an article about Charlie Kirk that was quite, negative. They published his obit that was quite, unfriendly. They say, don't speak ill of the dead. It wasn't very nice. Charlie said all kinds of things I disagree about world history. His basic, his big shtick was anti-communism, and I come out of the left, so I would disagree with a lot of it. But he did just get killed, right? And he had somebody on MSNBC who said that, people who say racist things, something like that. This madness. Yeah, this is not how we should act. You know what I mean? This is not how discourse should be, and this is going to be our whole country falling apart, and the imperialists are going to benefit it from this, right? They'll benefit. The more divided we are, the more confused we are, the more senseless violence there is, the more they'll be able to rule over us. We need to build something solid to demand that our country start moving in a better direction. And violence and a culture of political violence is not going to make that happen.
So let's move on. I did see, since we're talking about people who want to do us a bad turn, who want to destroy things, people who are up to no good, your book. Caleb's got a name. Oh my God, I got Trosky. I left the T out. Trotsky and the Neoconservatives. Well, but you know what I mean. I'll change it later
Yeah,
on.
that's okay. Yeah.
But at any rate, okay, Trotsky and the neoconservatives. It's interesting because a lot of people are like, who are the neoconservatives? They come out of, you look at so many of them, they're like, well, they were former communists. Then they were in the Bush administration, and they were George W. Bush, and some of those people came from Democrats. Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, they worked for Scoop Jackson as a Democrat. Now they're with George H.W. Bush. Wait a minute, they're with Trump. Oh, holy moly, they're with Biden. These people are chameleons.
Yeah, well, during the Bush years, people first started talking about the neocons. It started to become widespread, and the New York Times and others started talking about the role of Leo Strauss and others. And a lot of people observed, these people were once followers of Trotsky, many of them. They were Trotskyite communists, and then they became neocons eventually. And there was talk about it, and like Alex Jones and others would talk about it, and they would say, well, communists hate freedom, and these neocons are taking away our freedom. So it's just they hate freedom. Well, that's really simplistic, and that's not what's going on. And now with Nick Fuentes and others, you get kind of an anti-Semitic narrative. You get, well, these people are Jewish, and the neocons are Zionists, and they were communists, and it's the whole Jewish Bolshevik thing. That's really old anti-Semitic garbage. That's not what's going on there. I decided I had to write the book, because there are a number of books about these people, but there's never been a book that just gives this history, gives an answer to this question. So I decided to write Trotsky and the Neoconservatives and give the history from who Trotsky was to Trotsky's break with the New York intellectuals in 1939, to when the New York intellectuals started working for the CIA, to when the CIA-linked New York intellectuals went from the new left to the right. I go over that history point by point, and I show the trajectory and what common motivations there are. Their political ideas changed, but there's certain themes that remain. From the time of Trotsky right up to John Bolton today, there is a political continuity, and that's hatred for the people. They view the people as the enemy. The people are dangerous, right? Leon Trotsky, he was one of the Bolsheviks. He joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, but he'd had a really long-standing disagreement with Lenin. Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks in Russia, and Trotsky was born in Kherson in Ukraine, but he came to the United States. He came to Vienna, and he kind of lived in exile. He was kind of a wealthy guy in exile. He was a very famous writer and speaker. His biggest point of disagreement with Lenin was he had this theory called the permanent revolution. And basically, he said that you can't have a full socialist revolution in a country with a peasant majority. You have to have fully developed capitalism and industrial workers. And that if revolutionaries were to take power in Russia, they should just make it a base area to march communism to where it really matters, the West. And he loved the West. And he said New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. He lived in the Bronx, and he developed a reputation for refusing to tip in restaurants, which I find to be hilarious, right? They would bring him the bill, and he would then give the waiter a condescending speech about, you should form a union. You shouldn't rely on tips. I'm not going to tip you. And it was just, a condescending, kind of a pompous guy. And he had this disagreement with Lenin. He rejected the idea that peasants could ever be revolutionary. He joined the Bolsheviks, and, they made him the spokesperson for the army. He was the spokesperson for the Red Army, and he was quite an effective propagandist. They gave him an elaborate costume, with like a visor and a long coat and leather pants. And, they put him on a train, and he had this elaborate show he would do at the military bases. They would have the guys who deserted from the army, like lined up, like they were going to be shot in front of a firing squad. And they would have Trotsky arrive at like the last minute, and he would get off the train and stop and save their lives. And then he would give a speech to the crowd to fire them up to go and fight in the revolution. And then he would pick a random soldier out of the crowd and give them a gold watch that he had in his pocket, like the prize, and everyone would applaud. Wow. It was quite a good show. And he was very good at that. He was a very good front man for the Red Army. But then after the Russian Civil War was over, he had a real strong disagreement with the Soviet Communist Party. He didn't want them to fund the KMT government in China, the Chinese nationalists. He didn't like that idea of forming a united front. And he just had fundamental disagreements. And ultimately, he fled the Soviet Union. He moved to Turkey. He moved to France. And then he ultimately moved to Mexico City. And it's pretty clear that in the final years of his life, because Stalin and the Soviet government were his enemy, he was getting boosted by the Nazis. One of the main things the Nazis were doing during these years was promoting Ukrainian nationalism, the idea that Ukraine should break away from the USSR. Well, Trotsky started a campaign for an independent Soviet Ukraine. That was his big thing, an independent Soviet Ukraine. Another thing the communists were doing was trying to support the Spanish Republic as it fought against Franco, the fascist. Well, Trotsky's followers in Spain launched an uprising against the Spanish Republic, and they were known as the Fifth Column, trying to undermine the Spanish Republic from within, saying it wasn't truly communist or whatever. And that Roosevelt was the president, and the Communist Party of the United States, taking direction from the Soviet Union, entered an alliance with Roosevelt. So Congress started investigating Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party. And Trotsky was invited to testify before the committee investigating Roosevelt. And he said he would happily do it. And they were going to fly Trotsky to Washington, D.C. to give a speech condemning the Communist Party and condemning Roosevelt for his alliance with the communists. But then it was kind of a scandal. And, the Republicans are conservatives. So they ultimately rescinded the invitation. But Trotsky was somebody that he called himself a communist, but he was against the Soviet Union. And he maintained he was the true revolutionary. He had his theory of permanent revolution, and he had this alternative form of communism. And when World War II broke out, he was actively saying plague on both your houses in World War II. When France was invaded by the Nazis, he condemned the French Communist Party for building resistance on a patriotic basis. He said, I oppose nationalism. The French workers and the German workers should join arms. And that's when he was killed. He was ultimately killed because the feeling was that he would manipulate labor unions and communist activists to undermine the war effort. And so ultimately he was assassinated by a KGB operative who went to prison in Mexico and then went to Cuba. The Cubans gave him a big parade and a medal and flew him back to the Soviet Union after he got out of prison. It was very much, he was just this alternative, this communist who had broken with the Soviet Union. And it actually is an interesting parallel to Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser. You ever hear of them? They were two Nazis, right? Gregor and Otto Strasser, two brothers that were in the Nazi party. And on the night of the Long Knives, after Hitler came to power, he killed one of them, Gregor Strasser. He executed him. So then his brother, Otto Strasser, fled to Britain. And from Britain, he had a radio show claiming he was the true Nazi and that Hitler had sold out Nazism, right? And he was the true Nazi. And it was an intelligence operation. If you're running propaganda against a country, right, you don't just demonize their ideology. You find your own interpretation of their ideology, right? And say, well, they're handling it wrong, right? This is a manipulation. And the Strasserism was to Nazism what Trotskyism was to communism, basically. And you can look at that. So he had this big following in New York City. And a lot of wealthy intellectuals and others, it was really trendy to be a communist, but the Communist Party was kind of toning things down to support Roosevelt. They were very patriotic, and they were playing up the idea that fascism was un-American, America's a democratic country, etc. And they were very patriotic, kind of, toning things down. And so the Trotskyists appeared more radical. They talked about dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. And there was a magazine started called Partisan Review. It was originally a Communist Party magazine, but it went out of business. And then it reopened as an anti-Stalin Trotskyist magazine with Sidney Hook, a very important college professor in New York City who worked for them. And another guy named James Burnham, who was the head of the philosophy department at NYU. And it was this Trotskyist magazine that was very academic, that a lot of these wealthy intellectuals were writing for. And it was very trendy, etc. So then 1939 happens, right? That's, the temporary non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And all of a sudden, those New York intellectuals, they can't have anything to do with the Soviet Union, right? They have to completely, cut their ties with Trotsky, who's saying the Soviet Union is a deformed workers' state. They can't be associated with him. And they come up with this theory that the Soviet Union is neither capitalist or socialist. They say it's bureaucrat collectivism. It's this new system. It's neither capitalism or socialism. It's worse than capitalism. It's the same system as Nazi Germany, and they have to oppose it. And Trotsky disagrees with them. They have a very ugly fight. The leader of them in New York City is a guy named Max Shachtman. And Max Shachtman and his followers, they cut their ties with Trotsky, and they form their own group. And after World War II, the Shachtmanites started working for the CIA, running anti-communist propaganda for the CIA. And the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is how they subsidized anti-Stalinist leftism. And you would have had no idea they were working for the CIA. And this Partisan Review magazine was all over the college campuses. And it was very edgy. It was against McCarthyism. It was against the military draft. And it talked about feminism. but it waged kind of cancel culture hate campaigns against people like Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was supportive of Stalin and the Soviet Union. So it demonized Albert Einstein, demonized Lillian Hellman, the playwright, and they launched kind of hate campaigns against pro-Stalin intellectuals. And then they would find people that were like copies, right? So Paul Robeson, you knew Paul Robeson Jr. He was this very, very well-known Black intellectual, Black entertainer, Black, leader of the civil rights movement, et cetera, who was pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin. So they found James Baldwin. And James Baldwin is a very skilled writer, but he's anti-communist. And so with Paris Review, a CIA-subsidized magazine, they pushed James Baldwin as the voice of Black intellectuals, et cetera, to distract from W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, right? And they didn't want communists to be leaders of the Black struggle because they thought that would undermine U.S. Foreign policy. And that this was an elaborate operation they ran, but they were on the left. They were Democrats. They were opposing Republicans, right? But they start talking about, they're against McCarthyism and they're against fascism. But they're changing what fascism is, right? Fascism isn't capitalism collapsing into authoritarianism. They start seeing fascism as just the evil of ordinary people. They pay for this woman named Hannah Arendt. And she goes to Jerusalem and she attends the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal. She writes a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem about how Adolf Eichmann is just a normal guy. He's just an ordinary person because deep down, ordinary people are Nazis, right? And it's the banality of evil, right? She writes about. He was in the YMCA before he joined the Nazis. Anybody could be Eichmann. This is just how people are, right? That's what she's writing about, right? And there's another writer, a woman named Susan Sontag, right? And she develops this idea. She says, well, communism is just the most effective form of fascism, she says. She talks about how, fascism is gymnastics and fascism is athletic displays. And it's suddenly fascism is not capitalism in decay. Fascism is suddenly this evil within ordinary people. So then fast forward to the Vietnam War struggle, 1968, 1969, the Black Panthers are growing in popularity. They're very, very popular, and they're an openly pro-Soviet, pro-Chinese, Marxist-Leninist group. On top of that, you've got the student anti-war protesters that are waving the Vietnamese flag, and the Palestinian resistance also. 1967, you have the 67 war, and Palestine becomes a cause that the New Left, the campus activists, and the Black Panthers are supporting. Suddenly, some of these Shachtmanites say, we've got to support Richard Nixon. The New Left is too pro-communist and too out of control. And Irving Kristol becomes a Nixon supporter in 1968, right? He was the head of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. He was a Trotskyist before that. And he becomes a Nixon supporter because he says, we got to stop the New Left. And then 1972, Max Shachtman endorses Richard Nixon. Because he says that these campus anti-war people are too far left, and that Eugene McCarthy, who the Democrats nominate, is too soft on the communists. And all of a sudden, these Trotskyists, in their their support for Israel, but also their hatred for Vietnam, their hatred for the Soviet Union, they're in the conservative camp, and they befriend this intellectual named Leo Strauss.
Yes.
And Leo Strauss, his whole thing is that there are some people that are just better than everybody else. They're the philosopher kings. He writes about the philosopher kings, and they're just superior, and that all the intellectuals and philosophers in history have written in code because the people would persecute them if they knew what they really thought. And Leo Strauss becomes kind of a mentor to these folks, and it's the Straussians, right? The followers of Leo Strauss, many who were former Trotskyists, they're the ones that start crafting foreign policy. Jeane Kirkpatrick was once a socialist, a follower of Max Shachtman, right? Carl Gershman, who headed the National Endowment for Democracy, appointed by Ronald Reagan, a former Trotskyist, worked with Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman is like this figure that all across the political left and the political right, you can find people tied to him. George Meany, who headed the AFL-CIO for years, Max Shachtman was his top advisor, his personal advisor, right? Bayard Rustin, who was Dr. Martin Luther King's, strategist, had been a follower of Max Shachtman. Michael Harrington, who started the Democratic Socialists of America, and Irving Howe, another big intellectual from Democratic Socialists of America, they were also followers of Max Shachtman. And you look at it, it's like the Shachtmanite Trotskyists, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party the smart people in the back room writing the strategy are former followers of Max Shachtman. It's very, very interesting. It's a story that needs to be told, and that's why I needed to write the book. There's been, Alan Wald wrote a book called The New York Intellectuals, and there's a lot, of books that touch on this, but I'm the first one to actually just sit down and say, what's the deal? What's the relationship between Trotsky and the neocons? And the book is doing quite well, I will say. I'm surprised at how well it is selling. But then it's a story that needs to be told. And because there's a lot of conversation about this, I think that's why there's been so much interest in it, because, I went on Kim Iverson's show and talked about it, and it exploded in popularity. And I've been getting requests from a lot of different people, a lot of conservative podcasts and others. People want to know about this. So I'm glad to tell this story.
Well, it is important, because when you start looking around, I'll as an example, this guy Mamdani or whatever in New York, he's big, and everybody's like, "Oh yes, Mamdani, he's great." And I said, "Well, I can make an argument that there's positive things going on there. Fair enough, but he's DSA, Democratic Socialists of America." I said, Bernie Sanders, AOC. I said, these DSA people, time and time again, they come out. We're like, "Oh wow, don't they look great?" And then before you turn it around, they're calling Maduro a dictator, and Putin's a dictator, and everybody that the CIA says is a dictator, they say they're a dictator. I don't trust them. I look at this guy's wife, and there seems to be spookery afoot. She just disappears before 2022. Good luck finding anything out about her. She is the invisible woman, and I'm like, this is very suspicious. I'm a pretty good investigator, and I can't find a damn thing about her at all, period. And she's supposed to be a Palestine activist. I can never find a rally she's attended, something that she said, something she's done. And why is it that Reuters and the BBC and the Washington Post and the New York Times absolutely love her? They love a person who's a Palestine activist? That's weird. So I look at these DSA people, and there seems to be spookery behind them. They are, every time I turn around, when it comes down to it, the neocons are saying something, and they're very quietly leaning with the neocons. So I don't trust them. So I thought, what's with these? Well, now you just kind of nailed it. The Democratic Socialists of America have a history that ties them to the Neoconservative Foundation ideology.
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about Mamdani, right, you have to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And it's interesting because Mamdani, I guess technically he's a Shia Muslim. He was born on the African continent. But if you look at the Palestine movement, you look at the Squad, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, this is the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was a group in Egypt that the CIA started funding in the 1950s to fight against Abdel Nasser, right? Abdel Nasser was like the socialist president of Egypt who built the power plant. It's the biggest power plant in the Middle East, the Great Aswan Dam. He was a secular, like Arab nationalist and socialist leader. The CIA funded a religious fanatic group in Egypt that wasn't that big at the time, called the Muslim Brotherhood. And then they blew up all over the Middle East. And they were in Syria, and they were in Libya, and they're all over the Middle East. And they are the primary allies of the United States in the Middle East. They assassinate communist leaders. They assassinate labor union leaders. And their main thing is that they view communism and Arab nationalism as the greatest evil, right? And that they believe in free market capitalism. And they actually, what their founder believed was that he said that America is more Muslim than the Middle East, right? That America, we don't believe in Islam, but we practice Islamic principles truly. We have an Islamic culture, even though we don't believe in the Quran. And that the Middle East, even though they believe in Islam, they're primitive and they're backward, and they haven't adopted the sophisticated Western ways. And that he wanted to Westernize the Middle East. And he believed that the way we live in the West is more in line with Islam. That's his belief. And the Turkish government was kind of overtaken by these forces. Erdogan, he comes out of, there's a cleric called Gulen, who was a CIA cleric who was aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's the movement that brought Erdogan to power. And the Qatari monarchy that runs Al Jazeera, they are also the main funders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, they are pro-U.S. and they launched uprisings against Assad in the 1980s, against the Syrian government. They fought against Gaddafi. Gaddafi hated them. And then when the Arab Spring happened, they were the main people that Barack Obama was using to destabilize Middle Eastern countries. And after the government of Tunisia fell, they won the elections. They were very key in the struggle against the Syrian government, the Muslim Brotherhood. But here's the catch. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't like Israel, right? They're anti-Israel because they're Muslims. I mean, how could they not be, right? They're anti-Israel. So, and Hamas started out as the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was funded by Israel because Israel, the Palestinian movement used to be led by communists, Yasser Arafat and the PFLP. So Israel brought the Muslim Brotherhood into Gaza and set them up to fight against the communists. And eventually they broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood and formed what's now called Hamas. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is anti-Israel, but it's pro-U.S. and anti-Russia, anti-China. It echoes U.S. foreign policy on everything else. Right. And however, the Trump people have really alienated the Muslim Brotherhood. And during the Bush years, part of the reason that Bush was so unpopular is he called it a crusade in the Middle East. He called the war on terror a crusade and really alienated a lot of Muslim Brotherhood people. You remember after 9/11, ABC News was running all these stories about Islam's a peaceful religion and all of that. And people were like, what's going on here? They're afraid of losing their allies in the Middle East, you know, the people who do their dirty work. And Obama comes in, and Obama wasn't a Muslim, but there was all this innuendo that he might be a Muslim, right? Well, you know, he went to a Muslim school, wink, wink, and he met with Edward Said, and the right wing are always calling him a Muslim. I argue that Barack Obama was a 21st century Napoleon, right? Napoleon, when he went to go conquer Egypt, he put up posters everywhere saying, I believe in the prophet, I'm a Muslim, follow me, don't follow the British. And he joked about it with his friends. He laughed about it. He was doing it, but it was a way to try and get support in the Middle East, was to fake out the people to make them think you're a Muslim. That's what Barack Obama was doing. He was faking out the Arab world to make it sound like he was a Muslim, to make it sound like he was somebody who could understand them so they could do the Arab Spring. They couldn't have done the Arab Spring with George W. Bush in office. If the Arab Spring had happened with George W. Bush in office, there'd be like 20 more Islamic republics of Iran right now. They needed somebody in office who could kind of court the Arab world. And he had a fight with Netanyahu. They didn't like each other and all of that. And the Muslim Brotherhood is a very important ally of the United States, but they're anti-Israel. And the whole Muslim world is furious about the horrendous genocidal crimes of Israel. So right now, we have a situation where the U.S. is desperate to keep the Muslim Brotherhood on their side. So they are putting all kinds of Muslim Brotherhood-aligned people in powerful places. And DSA is facilitating that, which is wild because the Muslim Brotherhood hates socialism. They think socialism is ungodly. They want free market capitalism, you know, but that's kind of what's going on here. The USA needs to have the Muslim Brotherhood be their allies around the world. But Netanyahu hates the Muslim Brotherhood, and Trump has even talked about putting them on the foreign terrorist list. He's never done it, but he's talked about it. And so that's kind of what's going on. And DSA is the vehicle through which the USA can continue to court the Muslim Brotherhood. And that is what we have to understand. Linda Sarsour, the head of the Arab American Democrats in New York City, you know, Keith Ellison, and I mean, all of the top Muslim Democrats, they're all Muslim Brotherhood linked people, right? And they have the Qatari and Turkish line on foreign policy. Basically, they wanted the Iran nuclear deal, but they hate Iran, but they're anti-Israel, but they agree with U.S. foreign policy on just about everything else. That's what we can understand there. And there is a lot of money coming from Qatar and Turkey into the United States. And that's a dirty secret that people don't want to talk about. But, you know, Sunni mosques in America, if they're not getting a check from Saudi Arabia, they're getting a check from Turkey and Qatar. That's just a reality. And the U.S. government wants that because they can kind of keep a check on the Muslim community and can have them protest in ways that are not at odds with U.S. foreign policy. You'll notice that there's not a lot of support for Iran among these pro-Palestine protests. Your rank and file pro-Palestine protester likes Iran. But the Palestine movement has generally suppressed pro-Iranian or pro-Houthi speech very significantly.
Well, let me show you this. I like to touch base with people every now and then on this. You can find, if you look her up, right, Mamdani's wife, and all the articles exactly like, who is Zohran Mamdani's wife, right? Mm-hmm. More articles. Who is this? Who is Zohran Mamdani's wife? Who is the wife? Who is the same story? Who is Zohran? Like somebody wrote it. Who is the same story over and over and over again, right?
Interesting.
Right. But when you look at it, you'll find there is absolutely nothing about her family, nothing about her background, nothing anywhere. And here's what I can't figure out. Why is it, let's say we go to the BBC, right? They love her. They talk all about her, 27-year-old artist, blah, 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 Syrian roots. Her work has appeared on BBC News and in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vice. Now look at that. She's a Palestinian loving person and pro-Palestinian, but her work is on BBC News, New York Times, Washington Post, Vice, which is of course the Neocon, right? You read about all about her. Oh my God, she's real. That's in the BBC, right? Rarely seen. And then there's nothing else about her. The rest of it is about him.
Yeah, well, and I think his mother is a prominent Hollywood director, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And you know what's interesting is I guess his father it was a guy who I guess he's of Indian descent but lived in Uganda, right?
Very wealthy, right?
Yeah, and that there was a layer of people on the African continent that were like pro-Soviet. They were like Soviet aligned. And when the Soviet Union fell, they pivoted into being like social democrats. Angela Davis was one of those people in America, right? She was part of the Communist Party. She defended the Soviet Union. But then when Gorbachev came along, you know, and was dismantling the USSR, she quit the Communist Party and supported Gorbachev. She condemned the coup, and then she denounced communism. You know, she's now a social democrat, right? That there's a layer of people like that. And that, you know, like the ruling party of Angola it's the MPLA, the People's Liberation Movement of Angola. It was a Soviet aligned party. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, they took communism out of their beliefs. They're technically social democrats, democratic socialists now. The African National Congress in South Africa is a similar story. And that there was a layer of people on the African continent that had been in the Soviet camp, but they had been constantly trying to get it to water things down and tone things down. And then when the Soviet Union fell, they pivoted right over into the US camp, right? They were people that were there to kind of tug the Soviet Union in a less radical direction. They were supporting Gorbachev. They were supporting perestroika. They were the reformist wing of the Soviet camp, and they became pro-US, right? And I think that's where Mamdani's father comes out of, right? He was an activist, a wealthy guy who, you know, was in the Soviet camp, but was a moderate and then went over to the pro-US camp. That's what it looks like to me. And internationally, that was a big current. And I mean, these things are quite interesting. You know, in America, we make it seem like anyone who's a socialist or a communist, that's scandalous. I remember when Trump spoke to the UN a few years ago, he said, you know, socialism, he was bashing socialism and he paused for applause. Like he thought the room was going to applaud for him. What he doesn't realize is like half the governments in the room are technically socialist, not really, but like they're members of the Socialist International, right? You know, like most governments on the African continent, you know, they're free market capitalist countries, but the party is technically a socialist party, like the British Labour Party or something like that, right? And in America, that's not the case. We don't realize that that's the case. There's a lot of people that invoke socialism, and it's kind of meaningless. It's just like, well, I want a good society for everybody.
Like Bernie Sanders and the DSA people, the Democratic Socialists, they use the term socialism, but the truth of the matter is, to me, they're not anti-imperialist. They're very pro-imperialist. They push, to me, the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America people are the worst possible thing because they try to create the concept that the Democratic Party is still salvageable, that all you have to do is get back into the Democratic Party and you can pull it left. They were the ones that's like, let's get Joe Biden in office and then we'll pull him to the left. Let's get Kamala Harris. They're never going to the left.
Yeah. No.
They're going to redefine the left and then say that I'm on the left once they redefine the left. But the DSA, they're the worst to me.
Yeah, well, DSA is an interesting animal. I mean, if you look at its history, Gloria Steinem was on the board of directors when it was founded, and she has bragged. She was the voice of American feminism, started Ms. Magazine, and she brags that her career started with the CIA. They paid her to go to World Youth Festivals and set off smoke bombs and spy on who was there. And Barney Frank, you know, who's now in Congress, he was in college with her, and they both did that with the CIA. They went to the World Youth Festival in Vienna and were spying on people and setting off smoke bombs and inciting fist fights between the Polish and Russian delegation, right? It was just pure CIA spook work, basically. That's where Gloria Steinem comes out of. And then she blew up to be the big voice of American feminism. She was one of the founding members of DSA. I think she's still a member, but she was one of the founders and one of their most prominent voices at the time. And they kind of came into prominence in like the late 70s and early 80s. They were first the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, is what they first called themselves. And they had a magazine called In These Times. And what they did is they were deprogramming communists, right? China, there were all these communists who had aligned with China, were sympathetic to China. They wanted to start a new communist party that would take direction from China rather than the Soviet Union. And China's politics shifted very rapidly, right? You know, China was pivoting into the US camp, then Mao died, and then they started having the market reforms. So a lot of these pro-China communists were very confused. And DSA had a whole method of bringing people in and deprogramming them basically and getting them to be Democrats and bringing them into the Democratic Party. And it was very successful. And there was a group called the Democratic Workers' Party, and it was led by Marlene Dixon. It was a China-aligned group. And the leader, Marlene Dixon, she went over to Bulgaria and she befriended the communist government of Bulgaria. And she was going to come back to the United States. And I guess she probably had some funding from Bulgaria. And she was going to change the name of her group to the Alliance Against American Militarism. They were going to buy a building in Washington, D.C. and start opposing U.S. wars. And then immediately they got accused of being a cult. The Cult Awareness Network was after them, and they liquidated it, and they joined DSA. And they ran off with the assets, and they merged into DSA. Very suspicious. Very, very suspicious. You look at that. And there's a lot of stories like that, where DSA was kind of, as the communist groups of the 70s were de-radicalizing and getting very confused, they used things like the Jesse Jackson campaign of 1984 as a way to get people back into the Democrat Party, right? Jesse Jackson ran for president, and he put Amiri Baraka, who was a Maoist communist, he put him on the board of the Rainbow Push Coalition. So Amiri Baraka was saying, look, you can be a Maoist communist and be a Democrat like Jesse Jackson. And, you know, these were strategic things that they did. Harold Washington ran for mayor of Chicago, and a lot of communists campaigned for Harold Washington. It was a way of just kind of de-radicalizing people. And then the United Auto Workers, the UAW union, you know, they have something called the Solidarity Center, which is paid for by the CIA. It coordinates CIA trade union work all over the world. It's like a way that the CIA subsidizes the UAW. Is they have this building where a bunch of people work and do CIA work in the name of organized labor. It's called Solidarity Center. The UAW started paying for these big DSA conferences that happened in the late 70s and early 80s. Where they would have a lot of funding, and a lot of people would go there and they would say, look, communism is un-American. It's just not the American way. It's not democratic. Join the Democratic Party and we'll get socialism one step at a time and all of this. And it was very much, you know, and to be fair, a lot of these communist groups were a little bit nuts, right? They were a little intense, right? There was the criticism, self-criticism, where, you know, people have to kind of confess their mistakes in front of the group and get humiliated. And there was these groups were a little intense, you know, and people would have to, like, you know, donate huge amounts of money and dues and stuff. And so people kind of felt, a lot of people felt kind of demoralized. And also the groups, you know, some of them were a little wacky and abusive. And so DSA developed this method of just kind of bringing people in and saying, well, communism is no good, be a Democrat. And that's kind of where it came from. And then it was almost out of existence. In the 90s, in the early 90s, people didn't even know DSA existed. Then out of nowhere, John Sweeney became the head of the AFL-CIO. And he was a DSA guy. And all of a sudden, the head of the AFL-CIO is a DSA guy. And so DSA is you know, this big group in the AFL-CIO. And then they also kind of went out of existence and no one knew they existed, you know. And then I remember when I was first getting politically active, I was protesting the Iraq War, and they would have a list of groups endorsing the protests. DSA's name would be on the list, and people would say, do they still exist? Is that a thing? People didn't even know it was a thing. It was like, they had a newsletter on their website. It was like a photocopy of one sheet of paper. They had a banquet like once a year where Cornel West would give a speech, and that was it. It was not an organization. It was just kind of, people joked it was like a club for people that were like labor union activists or something. It was almost like non-existent. But then when the Bernie campaign got going, all of a sudden DSA exploded once again. Here it is. It's everywhere. They got candidates in every city. And DSA is kind of like the ruling class of America's winter coat. You know, when it's cold outside, you take your winter coat out, but most of the time it's staying in the closet, right? Unless it's, you know, there's snow on the ground. That's what DSA is. When there's a reason, when there's a crisis, when a lot of people are angry at the system, DSA suddenly reappears to do their thing. And then when people calm down again, they put it back in the closet and it goes away for maybe 10, 15 years, but then they can bring it out at any time. And these people are all academics. A lot of them are college professors. A lot of them work in Hollywood and stuff. And they're kind of on standby in case they're needed, right? That's, you know, and like little things happen. I mean, Barbara Einreich, someone mentioned her in the chat. She wrote a pretty good book called Nickeled and Dimed. And she's a DSA member. And she wrote a book about low wage work and poverty in America. It was kind of a bestseller in like the late 90s, I think, you know, good for her. You know what I mean? That was something. And that, you know, there's like little things that DSA kind of people will do, but they don't become a factor unless there's like a wider discontent in society that needs to be quelled and controlled.
Well, you know, I'd like to kind of end up where we started. We started off talking about the Charlie Kirk stuff. we started off talking about, what was going on there. And so here's one of the things I said: Trump vows to hunt down those funding radical left violence. You go down here and he says he promised to use the full weight of his administration to investigate not only perpetrators, but also the organizations that fund it, support it, as well as those who go after our judges, law enforcement officials, and everyone else who brings order to our country. So again, he cited other incidents of extreme left-wingism, whatever that means.
We don't even know who did it.
We
don't even know who did it yet.
Exactly. When you get to this stuff, we have no idea that did it. But what do you have? The government already saying, we need to crack down. But we don't know who did it. We have no idea. As I said, there are indicators there that tend to make me believe that it was a professional job. But we have no idea who did it. And the government, Trump is the head guy, is already saying, and what did I say as soon as it happened? You know what the government always says? Something happened, we need to crack down. Something didn't happen, we need to crack down. Something might happen, we need to crack down. Something might not happen, we're bored. Perfect time to crack down. Everything that happens, it's always time to crack down on the people. We're going to go after the organizations that anybody who brings order to our country. Well, who is that? Extreme left-wingism. I didn't know what that means. From today, does it mean, if you listen to the Democratic Party, anybody who's in favor of LGBTQ plus stuff is extremely left. I don't care if they're pro-war, pro-genocide, pro-Ukraine, pro-big pharma, pro every corporation in the world. If they're in favor of the next Pride Parade, then they're extremely left. It has been totally redefined away from all of the things that traditional left. They can hate labor unions as long as they're in favor of the next Pride Parade or a trans bathroom bill. That's the only thing that matters anymore to the current definition that the Democratic Party gives of the left. So the bottom line is, this happened, and within hours, the government is saying, we got to crack down. It is now they can point to anyone who's saying, I don't like what Israel's doing. That's exactly what I thought a violent lefty who was planning on committing an assassination would say. That's where it's going to go, first and foremost.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I would really urge people to stop celebrating political violence. That feeds into this division, right? The red team versus the blue team divide. That's not real. Wherever you go in America, people agree on three big things. One, these wars that are being raged around the world, they're not for our benefit. They're for the benefit of some very rich people, and they're not making us a better country. Two, our living standard is going down, right? Our wages are decreasing, the cost of housing and the prices, we're getting screwed economically. And three, our freedoms are being taken away. Our right to free speech, our right to not have the government spy on us. And if we could build a coalition around those 3 points, protecting our freedom, demanding economic development, and ending these senseless, stupid wars around the world, it would have 80-90% support among the U.S. public. But we can't do that because we're too busy fighting over transgender bathrooms and fighting over and social media is so good at triggering people, right? Violent videos of killings and just setting off people's PTSD. And, we all have things in our past and painful memories and different associations. We all have been treated in ways that we shouldn't have. We've all had bad experiences. And social media is very, very good at tapping into people's resentment, tapping into people's pain, and just amping it up to the point that makes them very afraid. And that's the kind of thing that I feel like would make somebody want to do an awful, hateful thing like this, right? If you make somebody, if you psych somebody up, look, Trump is bad in a lot of ways, okay? But he's not Hitler. And I saw Trump was in the restaurant and they're chanting, Trump is the Hitler of our time. No, he's not. He's not the Hitler of our time. One thing about Hitler was you couldn't go up to Hitler in a restaurant and say, you're the mass murderer of our time. If you did that, you got disappeared and never heard from again. So Trump is not the Hitler of our time. And the fact that you walked up to him and said he was is proof that he is not. Okay. Trump is bad in a lot of ways. I'm disappointed in his presidency in many, many ways, but he's not Hitler.
Let me say this. And these same people are supporting the Ukrainian banderites who walk around with the Hitler tattoos. So Trump is Hitler. We can't stand Hitler, but every friggin' thing with the Democrats and all of their people is blue and yellow, so they can support the people who are proud, who walk around with swastikas all over the place. That's the great hypocrisy and irony.
Yeah, and if Trump literally was Hitler, you can understand that somebody might think, oh, wow, I got to be the one to save the day and prevent the next Holocaust. Thing is, Trump is not Hitler, right? But if you amp up all over the social media that Trump is Hitler, we're all going to die, we're all going to get rounded up and put in camps, and, it's going to be the apocalypse and all of that. I mean, it's not the apocalypse. And the right is guilty of this too, right? Every Democrat is a communist. We're going to have Marxist dictatorship if any leftist ever does anything. Your typical conservative podcast nowadays, I joke about it, right? It starts out with, woke people being obnoxious, which there's plenty of obnoxious things about woke people. And then from there, it goes to, well, one of them quoted Karl Marx one time, or one of them was wearing a Mao shirt. And then from there, it goes to your standard Cold War anti-communist drivel, millions of people killed and never worked and everyone starved to death. Like, that's your typical conservative podcast these days. And it's like, it's painfully unintelligent, right? And you get these same people that are like, we can't trust the government when they lie and get us into wars. We can't trust what they say about Russia. But everything they said about the Soviet Union, everything they say about Cuba and China and North Korea is 100% true. And that's why we have to hate the Democrats. And it's just like, wait a second, listen to yourself here. Does that make any sense? I don't think it does, And so I think part of it, though, is nostalgia, right? That America was doing a lot better in the 1980s than it is now. And in the 1980s, communism was the enemy and America was defeating the commies, and nostalgia, right? Make America great again, right? It's remembering the good old days. And the anti-communism is part of the good old days in a lot of these folks' minds, right? And so I think that this is almost a generational thing. And that's what makes me wonder what is the Republican Party, what is the Trumpian opposition going to look like in 20, 30 years when they don't have the memory of the Reagan years anymore? What's it going to look like, I'm curious because it seems like a lot of conservative rhetoric is predicated on this notion that, the rainbow flag people and the Chinese government are the same thing. That is so obviously false, right? They are not, right? And that's very, very obvious. So, at some point, people are going to burst that bubble. At some point, people are going to see through it. And Tucker Carlson and some other voices on the American right, I've noticed, are starting to question things in their own way. They're not the way you and I are, but they are starting to question things. So I wonder how things will develop. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that we can't apply old political formulas, right? If I was just still doing the politics, the left thing that I was doing when I was in my 20s, I'd be completely lost right now. I wouldn't know what's going on. And that I'm constantly trying to learn different things and understand perspectives. I look at what's happening in Nepal right now, right? Well, the government there and a lot of the people there are saying this social media is bad for mental health. And they've wanted to regulate the social media companies to be in line with what they think is healthier. The social media companies have refused to play ball with them, so they're outlawing them. And so then it looks like the National Endowment for Democracy and George Soros and all of them sent a bunch of people out there to riot and violently overthrow the government. Now, I can understand being a young person and wanting more access to social media and feeling that some conservative, stodgy government, shouldn't be telling me what I can look at. And I can understand some of the frustrations people have in an impoverished developing country like Nepal. But at the same time, the National Endowment for Democracy and, George Soros, they're not going to make it better for you. And Nepal is right next to China. And, Nepal is friendly to China. And if Nepal is going to get out of poverty, China and their high-speed railways and their investment is going, their Belt and Road, Shanghai Cooperation has a lot to do with it. And it looks like this is about getting Nepal out of the Chinese camp and under the control of U.S. imperialism. So, but who knows? Something good. Maybe some of these students will realize that. And maybe this unrest right now, it's controlled by those other forces and it could go in a different direction. You never want to say never, right? The Houthi movement in Yemen, right? It started out, that was the Arab Spring, and it was a very liberal kind of thing. But the Houthis provided security to the protesters in the Arab Spring and won the trust of the protesters. And now the Houthis are running Yemen and Ansar Allah. So, and Fidel Castro, when he first came to power, he was called, the George Washington of Cuba by Dwight Eisenhower. They flew him to the United States and gave him a parade. But then he started moving to protect his country, and, things changed really quick. So you never know what could happen, but it doesn't look good in Nepal right now. It doesn't look like something that's going to benefit the people of Nepal or the rest of the world.
Yeah, and here's the problem, and I'll say this because you see it's in the chat. No, Trump's terrible. Trump's even. They got to call him Chump or Trump this, Trump, 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 Trump that. Trump did this, Trump did, and I say you don't understand the system because you're focused on one person. If you think Biden was the problem, you don't understand the system. In fact, Biden was the indicator. Anybody that says Biden didn't know what the hell was going on, his mind was gone, he was dementia. What does that tell you? That he wasn't in charge, but you think Trump's in charge. You recognize that the last president was absolutely not in charge. So was Biden terrible? Was he horrible? Was he a Zionist? All of that thing, that's true, but he wasn't in charge. And if you recognize he had dementia, you can say that. But somehow you think Trump's now in charge, a guy who will never be mistaken for, Stephen Hawking by any stretch of the imagination from the eye. I ain't saying I hate Trump. I ain't saying I love Trump. Here's what I'm saying. There's a lot of things I don't like about Trump. There's a couple things that Trump might have wanted to do that I might say that I would hope that would happen. But Trump is not in full control. And if he tries to do things that the system don't want, it ain't going to happen. You know what I mean? He has given orders that, just throw this real quick. Yeah. Trump gave written orders to leave Iraq and Syria in his last go round. And the government just ignored, the Pentagon ignored him. So people that are like, Trump, yes, he did. Trump's this, Trump's bad, Trump's this. All you're saying is, I really don't understand the system. So I'm caught up in the politics of personality because, boy, all we'd have to do is get rid of Trump and everything would be great because it's all about Trump. It's sad and pathetic.
Tulsi Gabbard is doing something amazing right now, and people aren't paying attention to it. There is a fight going on in the intelligence community. Tulsi Gabbard stripped the security clearances of the Russiagate people. All the people that lied and arranged for the Russiagate hoax have lost their security clearances. And John Bolton just had his home raided by the FBI. And it looks like they're going to charge him for cooperating with the other NATO countries against Trump and giving them inside information. This is very big. And Tulsi Gabbard, she gave a speech at the Neoconservatism Summit where she talked about the neocons, basically. And she talked about a faction in the deep state that thinks they're above the law. And she talked about how the lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Russiagate were the same people. James Clapper, right, was told by Bush, we want, that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. So you find it, you better find it. And then he did the same thing for Obama. When Obama said to him, we want you to find that Russia interfered in the election. So that's big, right? And that John Bolton, the fact that he had his home raided, and then also the CIA, now mainstream media, this is very bizarre thing. So, Tulsi Gabbard cannot comment. It's illegal for her to comment on the status of any CIA operative, covert or not, right? So she stripped the security clearance of somebody who is not a covert CIA operative, right? So after she stripped their security clearance, the CIA changed their status to covert and then leaked it to MSNBC. Oh, she outed a CIA agent. Oh my God, that's treason and all this. And she can't defend herself because she can't comment on the case. So MSNBC and the CIA director apparently is furious with Tulsi Gabbard, and it looks like there is a big fight. Tulsi Gabbard is trying to purge the intelligence agencies of the Neocon faction. That's very, very interesting to me, and that's really, really important. What Trump did, that meeting in Alaska, could not have happened without her revealing that Russiagate was a hoax. And I mean, the thousands and thousands of pages showing they just made Russiagate up. Russia did not interfere in the elections. They thought Hillary Clinton would win. They had a bunch of information on Hillary that they didn't release. They were going to release it when she won. Did you see that? Right? Hillary Clinton was addicted to painkillers. Hillary Clinton was having psychological meltdowns that they detected. They had all kinds of info on Hillary, and they set it aside because they looked at the polls and they said she's going to win, and they were going to release it afterwards. So they did not interfere in the elections. They consciously decided not to, right? So that's just a lie, and Russiagate, and that our whole politics, this war in Ukraine wouldn't be happening without Russiagate, right? If Trump had taken office the first time and been able to do what he wanted to do, which is get along better with Russia, right? There wouldn't have been a war, but he couldn't do that. He was accused of, all kinds of things and threatened and accused of being a Russian agent. And then on top of that, Russiagate is what enabled the FBI to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story, right? They said, oh, it's Russian propaganda. They're interfering, which they never did. And so Biden then got into office and an election was thrown because of Russiagate. And then when Trump, when Biden was in office, he continued to escalate, and ultimately you got the Ukraine war. Every single person who died in the Ukraine war would be alive today if it wasn't for the Russiagate hoax. This is like the weapons of mass destruction. It's a lie that led to a war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. And if they can set a precedent where that's some kind of crime and somebody goes to jail for that, you know, is that a bad thing? I mean, I don't want to wish ill will on anybody. You know, I've known people who suffered because of the prison system, and I don't want to wish harm on anybody. But if we could set a precedent where you don't lie and kill hundreds of thousands of people and there's some kind of consequence for doing that, that would be great, wouldn't it? And that's why, you know, I don't agree with Tulsi about Israel. And, you know, there's things that she says that I don't totally agree with, but we've got to support these peace talks in Alaska, and we've got to support Tulsi Gabbard, and we've got to show visible support in the streets for what she's doing, because I believe that if she can do what she's trying to do, if John Bolton can be prosecuted, if the Russiagate people can be pushed out of the intelligence agencies, we'll be a heck of a lot closer to world peace than if we weren't, you know. And I feel like we need to be in the game. It's not enough to just be on the internet complaining about things. I want to actually try to make the world a better place. And if Tulsi Gabbard can carry out some kind of purge in the intelligence agencies that inches us closer to not having World War III and to possibly, you know, doing business with countries like Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela, I think that's a good thing, you know. And I often tell people, look, even if we fail, isn't it better to try? Isn't it better to try to move things in a good direction, even if it doesn't, even if you're unsuccessful? Right. That's always been my attitude. So, you know, as much as I just want to educate people about what imperialism is and all of that and about the history, I also want to mobilize people. We were in the streets, and we're going to be in the streets again on October 4th. We're having a national day of action as CPI, thanking Tulsi Gabbard for her work and supporting the peace talks, calling for the prosecution of John Bolton. You know, the fight behind closed doors is very, very important. And my hope is that that people, you know, behind closed doors in Washington will see that there's people out in the streets who like the idea of John Bolton not getting away with what he did, who like the idea of Russiagate, you know, not being allowed something like that to ever happen again. So we'll see. But you got to just do your best. You know, it's very weird. It's clear to me there's a big fight inside the Trump administration. The Epstein thing where they had the list and then, oh, what list? Well, we never had a list. You know, something's going on there. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, what she did with the victims and Thomas Massey and all of that. I mean, there's a lot going on behind closed doors. And when there's divisions in the ruling class, that creates an opening for the people, right? And if you look at all the great revolutions of history, it started as a division among the ruling class. And then the people got activated and they got involved. And that's how society really changes, right? I mean, that's ultimately what it takes. There has to be division at the top, but then as the people get involved and get into motion, that's when you can get real mass movements that really change things. So that's my hope right now. I'm cheering for you, Tulsi. Go get them, Tulsi. Do the best you can. I am cheering for Tulsi Gabbard right now, and we want to do anything we can to support her efforts. We got to stop the neoconservatives. They were bad when they were Trotskyites, and they're bad today as neoconservatives. So that's my perspective.
Caleb Maupin, tell everybody where they can find you and follow all your good works.
Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. I've got a lot of books. I stream every night on my YouTube channel, Caleb Maupin. So check me out. And, you know, it's always good to talk to you, Garland. You and I have a good rhythm. You know, we get each other, and, it's been really, really great to work with you over the years. So,
all right. Well, always appreciate, you know, when you come on and all your good work and everything you're doing and your enthusiasm and your knowledge. You know, I always learn so much historically when I have you on and when we talk. So everybody, that's Caleb Maupin. You know where to find him. You see everything going across the bottom there. If you can afford to donate to the channel, even if you can't, the most important thing that you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.